fellow Trek Chatters, I'm Pit Trekkie, and welcome to another episode of Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. So, I've been planning to do this episode for a long time. It took a long time to gather the materials that I needed to do. So far, I've been able to gather so much information that I'm actually going to have to break this episode into two parts. So, basically, right now, I honestly feel like we're going through a drought regarding Star Trek news. So I just wanted to do something fun while we're waiting to find out when Strange New Worlds Season 3 is going to premiere or when Starfleet Academy is going to premiere. So what I'm going to talk about is the 1970s, which was a dry era for Star Trek, after Star Trek was canceled in 1969. And basically every fan knows at this point that after June 1969, when the original series was canceled, it went into syndication the following season. And it became an amazing hit because it was on around 6 o'clock at night for families Monday through Friday, and they got to really appreciate the show. So that's when Star Trek came back into being, essentially. And with this newfound popularity, people started to ask, is it ever going to come back to TV, or is it going to become some sort of TV movie, or even a movie? So that was basically all of Star Trek in the 1970s, mostly. The big majority of it, anyway. So the earliest attempt to actually bring Star Trek back to TV started around 1972. NBC had been showing interest in actually reviving the show, but when they crunched the numbers trying to create the sets, the costumes, the props, everything would have just been deemed too expensive. So basically what they said was, okay, we're going to pass on doing this project. But then in 1973, they obviously did Star Trek the Animated Series, which lasted for 2 seasons and was overall very much loved by the fandom. So, but again, Star Trek's popularity continued to keep growing, and with the Star Trek conventions going on, Paramount said, oh, we got an opportunity to do something with Star Trek and revive it. So what they did was they had a contract with Gene Roddenberry in 1975 to create the first Star Trek motion picture. And at this point, it was called The God Thing. And it was given a budget of $5 million. And there were pieces of it that were written and taken care of. Essentially what the movie was about was this alien object coming to Earth, and it reveals itself to be Jesus of the Bible, something to that effect. And I guess Paramount didn't really like what the story was really going to be about. There was a Vulcan master telling Spock how God was... He just seemed to be a weak god because he demanded the worship of everybody and was going to punish them for their sins even though he created them as fallible. So a lot of Catholics that were possibly in Paramount at the time felt this wasn't going to go over very well, so the movie got shelved. And the contract with Gene Roddenberry was terminated in August of 1975. Moving on to 1976, there was another Star Trek movie that was being prepared, and actually had mostly a script and had conceptual art done. Chris Bryant and Alan Scott had were hired actually to write a movie script, Planet of the Titans. They turned the script in March 1st, 1977, but again, Paramount didn't really care for this as a movie, so it was rejected and it was finally scrapped. There were a couple other opportunities that were brought up to try to bring Star Trek onto the movie screen, and those fizzled out as well. So that takes us to 1977. And at this point, Paramount's like, I don't know what to do with Star Trek anymore movie-wise, but maybe it would be beneficial if we have it back on television. Now, at that time, there were only 3 major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. The Dumont Television Network folded a number of years before. So Paramount wanted to come in and say, you know what, we're going to create a 4th television network, and they wanted to call it the Paramount Television Service. So on June 10th, 1977, Paramount came out and announced the Paramount Television Service and said that they were going to start with independent stations 1 night a week, Saturday nights. Star Trek Phase 2 was going to be the cornerstone series that launched the network at 8 o'clock, and then they were going to have 30 TV movies of the week produced by Paramount in the 9 to 11 slot. And then eventually as time would go on, the shows would grow and grow and grow. So Phase 2 started getting into full production. They actually created blueprints, sets, models, props, costumes. Basically, this was fully going forward. Now, the only way that they were planning on reducing the cost a little bit was to, instead of creating all new costumes for the characters, they were going to use the original series uniforms. Which would have been kind of odd, seeing 60s style uniforms in 1970s era sets. But that's what they were going to do. And they also, because Leonard Nimoy refused to be in the show, they created Ilea and the character of Zahn to replace Spock as science officer. They also created Willard Decker, and part of the rumor was that they weren't sure if they were going to be able to keep William Shatner for super long, so they needed to have a backup as a captain just in case. So Commander Decker was created. Now, what happened, there were a couple other little things that went down. Obviously, in May of 1977, Star Wars came out, and it was a big hit on the big screen. And then also, they started crunching the numbers at Paramount, and they started to realize that Paramount television service couldn't be supported by their expected advertising revenue, and so the network decided, we're going to fold this. But yet they realized they spent a whole ton of money on Phase 2 already. So what they decided to do was scrap the series, but they were going to turn the pilot episode, In Thy Image, into Star Trek the Motion Picture. And basically they were hoping that by doing that, they wanted to kind of recuperate some of the $500,000 they spent on starting Phase 2 and getting Paramount Television service going. Now, in order to save face and not be embarrassed, they didn't announce that Phase 2 was canceled or that the Paramount Television service was canceled. And they continued to work on Phase 2 for 5 more months, getting scripts together, things of that nature. But they were also at the time starting to figure out what they were going to do with the Phase 2 sets, so that way they could actually increase it and make more details. So basically, what I want to do with you today is give you a history of Star Trek Phase 2 in pictures. I have been looking for years trying to find all these different pictures from the production, whether they're blueprints, conceptual art, actual pictures of the sets, and I've come up with a nice little library of things. So, because again I found so many pictures over the last few years, I'm going to have to break this up into 2 specific episodes. So, part 1, I'm really hoping that you're going to enjoy. It's going to focus on the Enterprise itself, its redesign, and the models for the Phase 2 Enterprise. The Enterprise from Phase 2, its bridge, and engineering sets. And then there will be more coming in Part 2. So sit back and start to enjoy Star Trek Phase 2, A History in Pictures. Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed watching part 1 of Star Trek Phase 2, A History in Pictures. I really enjoyed putting this episode together for you, and I'm looking forward to showing part 2 for you as well. Feel free to like the channel or subscribe to the channel if you found this episode entertaining. Please put your comments down below so that way I can answer them for you and we can talk a little bit about what was discussed in this episode. You can follow the show. Obviously, just come to YouTube, type in Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. It'll take you directly to my channel. You can also follow the show on Facebook, facebook.com/Pittsburgh's Trek Chat. You can also follow the show on X at PGH Trek Chat. Looking forward to showing you part 2 of this special 2-part episode. And until then, may yins live long and prosper.